U.S. tanks in World War II. The sound of steel. In every great war, there are moments when history turns not by speeches or treaties, but by the grinding sound of steel moving forward. In World War II, that sound came from American tanks' engines roaring, tracks biting into foreign soil, pushing through fire, smoke, and fear. They were not symbols of conquest. They were instruments of liberation. These machines did not fight alone. Inside each tank were American soldiers, farm boys, factory workers, students, men who learned to trust steel and each other in the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. Their battlefield was not just the open desert or the ruined city. Their battlefield was fear itself, conquered inch by inch. When people speak of World War II, they often remember beaches, bombers, and generals. Less often do they remember the armored crews who broke through enemy lines, shielded infantry, and absorbed the first odor of counterattacks. These were the hidden heroes of America's ground war. This is their story. America before the war. In the late 1930s, the United States was not a nation prepared for armored war. The memory of World War I still lingered: mud, trenches, and limited mechanization. Tanks were seen largely as infantry support weapons, not the decisive force they had become in Europe. Across the Atlantic, however, a new form of warfare was emerging. Germany's Blitzkrieg demonstrated that armored forces, when combined with radio communication, air support, and speed, could shatter entire armies in weeks. Poland fell. France collapsed. Europe burned. American military observers watched carefully. Reports flowed back to Washington describing mobile warfare unlike anything the U.S. Army had faced. The conclusion was unavoidable. If America entered this war, it would need tanks, not dozens, but tens of thousands. The industrial awakening of America. When war came to America after Pearl Harbor, the response was total. The nation transformed itself into an arsenal of democracy. Factories that once built cars now produced tanks. Assembly lines never slept. Steel, rubber, oil, and manpower flowed toward a single purpose: victory. American tank design reflected American philosophy. Instead of chasing a single perfect machine, the United States focused on reliability, mass production, and ease of repair. A tank that could be built quickly, shipped overseas, fixed in the field, and returned to battle was more valuable than one that existed only in small numbers. This approach would define American armored warfare. The goal was not duels of prestige, it was sustained pressure, continuous movement, relentless advance, a war of endurance that America was uniquely positioned to win. The American tank soldier. A tank was nothing without its crew. 5 men inside a steel box: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, each dependent on the others for survival. Training was intense, unforgiving, and often rushed. There was no time for perfection. War was coming fast. Tank crews learned to fight blind, deafened by engine noise, surrounded by smoke and heat. They memorized commands, movements, and emergency procedures until reactions became instinct. In combat, hesitation could mean death, not just for the crew, but for the infantry relying on them. These men were not reckless. They were disciplined. Courage in armored warfare was not charging blindly. It was staying inside the tank when instinct screamed to run. It was holding position under fire so others could advance. By 1942, American tanks and tank crews were ready, not fully tested, not yet perfected, but committed. Their first great trial would come not in Europe's cities, but in the open deserts of North Africa, where theory would meet reality in fire and sand. North Africa, America's first armored test operation torch. The entry into fire. In November 1942, American tanks rolled into combat for the first time in World War II. Operation Torch was more than a landing. It was America's armored debut on the global stage. The deserts of North Africa would decide whether American theory could survive the reality of modern war. The terrain was deceptive. Vast open spaces seemed to promise freedom of movement, but they offered no forgiveness. Every mistake was visible. Every halted tank became a marker on the battlefield. For American crews, the desert was not empty. It was watching. The first shock. Real war. Real losses. Early engagements exposed painful weaknesses. American tank units, still inexperienced, often advanced too quickly, without adequate reconnaissance or infantry support. Enemy anti-tank guns lay hidden, waiting patiently. When they fired, the results were devastating. At battles such as Kasserine Pass, American forces suffered harsh defeats. Tanks were knocked out. Units fell back in confusion. It was a brutal awakening, but not a breaking one. The U.S. Army did not deny reality. It confronted it. These losses carried an unspoken message. Modern armored warfare demanded coordination, patience, and leadership. Speed without discipline was suicide. Armor without infantry was blind. And courage without doctrine was not enough. Adaptation under fire. The American response. America adapted quickly. Command structures were reorganized. Training was intensified. Tank infantry cooperation became mandatory, not optional. Artillery coordination was sharpened. Radios were used aggressively to maintain control even in chaos. Tank commanders learned to fight smarter, not harder. Movement was calculated. Formations widened. Reconnaissance units moved ahead of the main force. Tanks stopped charging blindly into fire and began shaping the battlefield before committing. Logistics also became a weapon. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all were pushed forward relentlessly. American armor could absorb losses not because it was invincible, but because it could be repaired, refueled, and returned to battle faster than the enemy expected. The Sherman emerges. A workhorse of war. The M4 Sherman became the backbone of American armored forces. It was not the heaviest tank of the war, nor the most heavily armed, but it was reliable, adaptable, and available in overwhelming numbers. Its strength lay in consistency. The Sherman could be shipped across oceans, repaired in the field, and operated by crews trained rapidly but effectively. It fit America's strategy perfectly. Sustained pressure through mass and coordination. Tank crews learned to use terrain creatively: small rises, shallow depressions, smoke screens. They learned when to fight and when to maneuver. Survival became a product of judgment, not luck. The human factor. Courage inside steel. Inside each tank, conditions were brutal. Heat was suffocating. Noise was constant. Visibility was limited. When a tank was hit, flames and smoke filled the compartment instantly. Crews trained knowing that survival depended on calm under unimaginable stress. Tankers developed an unbreakable bond. They trusted each other with their lives because that trust was literal. A single mistake by one crew member could doom all five. Discipline became a form of respect. Acts of heroism were constant and quiet. Crews stayed inside damaged tanks to cover infantry retreats. Drivers moved disabled vehicles under fire. Commanders exposed themselves to guide others forward. These moments rarely reached headlines, but they saved lives. Victory through evolution. By the end of the North African campaign, American armored forces were transformed. They had entered the war inexperienced and left it hardened, disciplined, and confident. The desert had taken its toll, but it had also forged a modern armored army. These lessons would travel with them to the mountains of Italy, the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes. America had learned how to fight with armor, and the war was far from over. Italy, mountains, cities, and ambush warfare. A new front, a new war. When American tanks arrived in Italy, they entered a battlefield unlike anything they had known before. The wide horizons of North Africa were replaced by narrow mountain roads, steep ridge lines, rivers, and ancient stone towns. Italy was not a place for speed. It was a place for patience, endurance, and precision. The enemy understood the terrain perfectly. Every ridge could hide an observer. Every village could become a fortress. Every bridge was a potential death trap. For American armor, Italy would be a war measured not in breakthroughs, but in hard-fought yards. The road is the battlefield. In Italy, roads were everything, and roads were few. Tanks could not maneuver freely off-road in mountainous terrain. A single narrow route might carry an entire armored column. If that road was blocked by mines, demolitions, or a destroyed bridge, the advance stopped completely. Enemy forces exploited this reality. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover bends in the road. Mines were planted at choke points. Artillery zeroed in on predictable routes. American tankers learned quickly. Every curve could be lethal. The invisible war. Mines and demolitions. Mines became one of the most feared threats in Italy. They waited silently beneath mud, gravel, and stone. A single mine could tear off a track, immobilizing a tank and turning it into a stationary target. Progress slowed to a crawl, as every meter of ground had to be questioned. Combat engineers became indispensable. Under fire, they probed the ground, marked safe lanes, and dismantled explosives. Their work demanded courage equal to any frontline assault, because a single mistake meant death not only for them, but for everyone behind them. Rivers and bridges. Steel against water. Italy's rivers formed natural defensive lines. Bridges were destroyed as American armor approached, forcing tanks to halt under observation and fire. Each crossing became an operation in itself requiring smoke, artillery suppression, infantry security, and rapid engineering. When crossings succeeded, tanks surged forward to expand the bridgehead, often fighting while engineers were still working behind them. These moments demanded absolute trust between armor, infantry, and engineers, because failure meant isolation and destruction. Urban combat, stone and fire. Italian towns turned armored warfare into close-quarters combat. Streets were narrow. Buildings were thick stone. Enemy soldiers fired from windows, rooftops, and cellars. Tanks could not see above themselves. Infantry had to move step by step, with tanks providing firepower and protection. At these ranges, anti-tank weapons were deadly. A single hidden gun could strike at point-blank range. Tank crews learned to rely on infantry signals, hand gestures, and shouted warnings. Survival depended on teamwork measured in seconds. Artillery. The armor's shield. In Italy, artillery became the great equalizer. Before tanks advanced into villages or up exposed slopes, artillery hammered enemy positions. Forward observers moved with armor, calling in precise fire to neutralize threats tanks could not reach. This coordination saved lives. It reduced ambushes. It slowed the enemy's ability to react. Artillery did not replace tanks. It enabled them to survive in terrain that favored defenders. Night operations, war in Shadow Italy, forced American armor to fight at night. Movement under darkness reduced exposure but increased danger. Headlights were forbidden. Crews navigated by memory and instinct. Engines ran quietly. One wrong turn could lead into a minefield or enemy-held village. Night fighting demanded discipline at the highest level. Crews learned to trust orders they could not see and threats they could not hear. This quiet professionalism became a defining trait of American armored units. The cost of the mountains. Italy was slow, exhausting, and costly. Tanks were lost not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in grinding attrition. Crews fought the enemy, the terrain, and fatigue. Yet they kept moving forward, because every village taken weakened the enemy's grip on Europe. The Italian campaign forged patience and discipline. It taught American armor how to fight when speed was impossible and surprise was rare. These lessons would soon be tested again on the shores of France. From Italy's mountains, American tanks would move north to face the most complex battlefield yet. Normandy would compress the war into tight spaces, deadly ambushes, and relentless resistance. What American armor had learned so far would be tested to its absolute limit. Normandy, hedgerows, ambushes, and the birth of innovation. The invasion begins, armor comes ashore. June 1944. Normandy. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was not only a test of courage, it was a test of coordination on a scale never before attempted. For American armored forces, D-Day meant something brutally simple. Get tanks ashore, get them moving, and support the infantry no matter the cost. Some tanks never made it past the surf. Rough seas swamped flotation devices. Vehicles sank under their own weight. Crews drowned before firing a single shot. These losses were invisible to history books, but they were paid in full by American tankers before the battle even began. The hedgerow problem. Beyond the beaches lay Normandy's deadliest secret, the bocage. Thick hedgerows, centuries-old, lined every field, forming earthen walls reinforced by roots and stone. To a tank, they were vertical fortresses. Visibility dropped to near zero. Every field became a separate battlefield. Enemy forces exploited this terrain ruthlessly. Anti-tank guns and infantry waited on the far side of hedgerows, firing at point-blank range as American tanks crested embankments. Many crews were hit before they even saw their enemy. Close combat. War measured in yards. Normandy erased distance. Battles were fought at ranges of 30 meters or less. Tanks could not maneuver freely. Infantry was everywhere, sometimes unseen. A tank that stopped became vulnerable instantly. Tank commanders learned to expose themselves deliberately, standing half out of turrets despite sniper fire, to see what periscopes could not. Their visibility often meant survival for the entire crew. Infantry and armor. A shared fate. In Normandy, tanks and infantry became inseparable. Infantry protected tanks from close-range threats. Tanks shielded infantry from machine guns and fortified positions. When this bond broke, casualties soared. When it held, progress followed. Hand signals, shouted warnings, and instinct replaced formal commands. The battlefield was too loud and too close for radio discipline alone. Trust became the most valuable currency. The Rhino is born. American ingenuity. Normandy demanded innovation. Crews improvised steel prongs welded to tank fronts, hedgerow cutters, nicknamed rhinos. These devices allowed tanks to punch through embankments instead of climbing over them, denying defenders their killing shots. This simple innovation changed the campaign. Tanks regained initiative. Ambushes failed. What began as field improvisation became standard equipment, proof that American adaptability could turn disadvantage into momentum. Breakthrough. Operation Cobra. Operation Cobra shattered the stalemate. Massive aerial bombardment stunned enemy defenses. American tanks surged forward through gaps, exploiting chaos with speed and coordination learned through hard months of fighting. Once free of the hedgerows, American armor returned to movement warfare. Columns raced through liberated towns. Enemy units collapsed under relentless pressure. Normandy was no longer a trap. It was a gateway, the cost of Normandy. Victory came at a price. Normandy consumed tanks and men at an alarming rate. Burned out Shermans littered fields and lanes. Crews were replaced, often overnight. Yet, the advance never stopped. Tankers carried loss quietly. There was no time to mourn properly. The mission demanded forward movement. Their strength was not in denial, but in resolve. Normandy's legacy. Normandy reshaped American armored warfare forever. It proved that victory belongs not to the strongest machine, but to the force that adapts fastest. Tanks, infantry, engineers, and air power acting as one had broken the enemy's grip on Western Europe. From the hedgerows of France, American tanks would now race eastward. But one final trial remained: winter, forests, and a desperate enemy preparing a last gamble. The Ardennes, the Rhine, and the final push. Winter, steel, and the price of victory. Winter strikes back, the Ardennes offensive. In December 1944, as snow settled over Western Europe, the war delivered one last brutal surprise. In the forests of the Ardennes, the enemy launched a massive counteroffensive. It was a gamble born of desperation, and it would be answered by American steel in the harshest conditions imaginable. The terrain was unforgiving. Narrow forest roads, icy surfaces, and limited visibility turned every movement into a risk. Tanks struggled for traction. Engines labored in freezing temperatures. Yet the armored units pressed forward, knowing that holding key roads meant holding the line, holding the crossroads. In the Ardennes, battles were fought for crossroads and villages whose names would become symbols of endurance. American tanks often fought defensively dug in, hull down, covering approaches while infantry entrenched around them. Mobility gave way to stubborn resistance. Fuel shortages and weather grounded Allied aircraft, isolating armored units. Yet discipline held. Crews rationed fuel. Repair teams worked in snowstorms. Tanks became anchors of defense, silent, cold, and unyielding. When the sky clears, counterattack. When the weather finally broke, Allied air power returned, and with it, momentum. American armor shifted from defense to counterattack. Tanks pushed through snow-covered roads, regaining lost ground and shattering the enemy's last hope for reversal. The Ardennes had tested everything American armor had learned: discipline, logistics, leadership, and resolve. And it had proven that the U.S. Army could not only advance, but endure. New steel. The arrival of the Pershing. As the war entered its final phase, a new American tank appeared on the battlefield, the M26 Pershing. Heavier, better armored, and more powerfully armed, it represented the evolution of American tank design forged through years of combat. Though fewer in number, Pershings symbolized a clear message. America had adapted, learned, and arrived at the war's end with an armored force capable of meeting any challenge head-on. The Rhine. Breaking the last barrier. The Rhine River stood as the final natural barrier before the heart of enemy territory. Crossing it meant committing to the final destruction of the enemy's ability to fight. For American armor, it was a moment of historic weight. Under covering fire, engineers built pontoon bridges. Tanks crossed as soon as planks were laid, expanding bridgeheads while artillery thundered behind them. The crossing was not symbolic. It was violent, dangerous, and decisive. The final advance. No turning back. Beyond the Rhine, resistance collapsed unevenly. Some units fought desperately. Others surrendered en masse. American tanks moved relentlessly, capturing cities, cutting supply lines, and freeing prisoners of war. The mission was no longer just tactical, it was moral. Every mile advanced shortened the war. Every road taken saved lives that would have been lost in prolongation. The cost of victory. Victory was not free. Thousands of American tankers were killed or wounded. Tanks burned. Crews were lost inside steel hulls. Every battlefield carried reminders of the price paid. These sacrifices were not statistics. They were names, families, futures. Remembering them is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of responsibility. Legacy. The hidden heroes remembered. When the war ended, American tanks fell silent. But their legacy endured. They had not been perfect machines, but they had been present, reliable, and decisive. They had carried American soldiers across continents and into history. Veterans returned home, with memories etched in steel and fire. Museums, monuments, and cemeteries became the places where the nation remembered not just victory, but the cost of defending freedom. American tanks in World War II were more than weapons. They were promises that America would fight, endure, adapt, and prevail. Inside their steel hulls were citizens who became soldiers, and soldiers who became guardians of history. They were not always celebrated. They were not always remembered by name. But without them, the road to victory would never have been opened. These were the hidden heroes of American armored warfare, and their legacy still rolls forward, dedicated to the men who fought inside steel so others could live in freedom.